You think your neighborhood is safe? Until three men in fake uniforms show up at your door, waving bogus badges and telling you you're under arrest. That happened to me. Except they didn't know one thing. I'm the chief of police. And when the HOA crossed the line, I showed them what real law enforcement looks like. The first sign that the HOA was slipping out of bounds came not in some dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet, creeping arrogance of Nancy Grant, our HOA president. She strutted around the neighborhood with her clipboard like a general on parade, barking about rules that didn't exist and waving letters she claimed carried the weight of law. The problem was, I knew the law, not from television, not from Google searches, but because enforcing it was my life. I wasn't just a homeowner on Elmwood Drive. I was the chief of police for the county, and while I usually let petty HOA politics slide, there are moments when silence is surrender. It began with my truck, a sturdy county-issued pickup that sat legally parked in my driveway, plates up to date, inspected, and registered under every code that mattered. Nancy, however, saw it as a violation of community appearance standards. She taped one of her infamous letters to my door, a pseudo-legal notice citing HOA Code Section 14(3), non-compliant vehicle storage. According to her, I owed a $200 fine for every week my truck remained visible. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was insulting. State Vehicle Code 22507. 2 was crystal clear. HOAs had no authority over public or private parking when vehicles were compliant with state law. I ignored the fine. That's when Nancy escalated. She appeared one Saturday morning flanked by two men in navy polo shirts. They introduced themselves as HOA compliance officers. Their demeanor was stiff, their tone rehearsed, and the badges, the moi. I flashed, might as well have come from a toy aisle or an inkjet printer. One of them puffed his chest and declared, "Sir, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to arrest you for non-compliance with HOA code." That single word, arrest, set off alarms in my head. HOAs don't have arrest powers. Arrests are governed by Penal Code 830. 1. Reserved only for sworn peace officers of the state. These two weren't officers. They were actors in a bad skit, weaponizing fear. I stood calmly, concealing my smirk, while the body camera clipped under my shirt quietly recorded every word. The lens caught the way their badges gleamed under the porch light, cheap laminate edges curling, numbers printed in bold Arial font. I asked them to repeat themselves, pressing for clarification. They doubled down, claiming HOA code enforcement carried the same authority as law enforcement. Every lie they spoke stacked more evidence in my favor. I didn't correct them, not yet. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them confident in their false authority, because when the hammer fell, I intended it to fall hard. As they left, I noted the nervous glances they shared, the way one kept adjusting his badge as though trying to convince himself it looked real. Their act was fragile, and fragile things break easily. I closed my door and sat down at my desk, reviewing the footage already uploaded to my secure drive. My instincts told me this wasn't over. Nancy had tested me once and found resistance. The next move would be bigger, bolder, and far more reckless. She thought her clipboard and her cronies could bend the law. She was about to learn what happens when the law pushes back. That night, the neighborhood was still. Porch lights glowed across manicured lawns, sprinklers clicked on in rhythmic bursts, and curtains swayed as neighbors peeked out, curious but silent. They knew Nancy was stirring something, but fear kept them quiet. Fear of fines, fear of retaliation, fear of the iron grip. Nancy loved to flex. I wasn't afraid. Not of her, not of her fake officers, not of her paper-thin rules. But I knew this was only the beginning. And beginnings, especially in my line of work, always led somewhere darker. The next morning, just as the sun cut through the blinds of my living room, the escalation arrived. I heard the low rumble of an engine outside, then the faint flicker of amber lights bouncing off the walls. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee still steaming in hand. There it was, a white SUV parked at the edge of my driveway, stenciled with the words HOA Security Division in crooked vinyl letters. The doors creaked open, and out stepped the same two imposters from the day before. This time, they weren't playing neighborly. They had props. One carried plastic zip ties looped around his belt like handcuffs. The other had a clipboard thicker than a phone book, filled with papers meant to intimidate. Their swagger was cartoonish, like kids wearing their father's uniforms. But what caught my attention wasn't their gear. It was their language. "Sir," the first one barked. Under HOA code enforcement, you are hereby under arrest for repeated noncompliance. Step aside or we will be forced to detain you. They said it with all the confidence of men who thought intimidation could substitute for legality. But what they didn't realize was that they had just crossed the red line. Impersonating a peace officer isn't a misunderstanding. It's a federal crime. Title 18 U.S. Code 912 spells it out plain. Anyone pretending to be an officer of the United States and acting as such can face years in prison. And they were doing it in my driveway, on camera, within earshot of my neighbors. I played along. I raised my hands, feigning compliance, stepping slowly off my porch. My voice was calm, almost apologetic. All right, I said. Just to tell me exactly what law I broke. They looked at each other, smug. HOA Ordinance Code 22B, one of them declared, as though quoting the Bible. When he reached for my wrist, I moved. My training wasn't about brute force, it was about precision. I twisted his arm, dropped my weight, and sent him collapsing with a snap that echoed down the street. His scream followed, high-pitched and desperate, his knee folding the wrong way as he clawed toward the car. The second charged, zip ties swinging like weapons, but he didn't last long either. A hook of my boot swept his legs, and his body hit pavement with a dull crack. His knee dislocated instantly, leaving him writhing. The neighborhood was watching now, blinds lifted, doors cracked open. For years they had feared Nancy and her self-appointed empire, but tonight they saw something else, the law itself fighting back. I crouched over the two men as they whimpered. From my pocket I pulled my real badge, silver, solid, heavy, not some laminate joke. Their eyes widened. I leaned close and said evenly, "You just committed impersonation of a peace officer, unlawful detention, and trespassing. You're not going home tonight. You're going to prison." I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth was louder than anything I could yell. Within minutes, the blue and red of real patrol cars lit the street. Sirens wailed, doors slammed, and two of my officers stepped out with weapons drawn. The imposters were handcuffed with real cuffs this time, read their Miranda rights, and shoved into the back of a squad car. Nancy's plan had failed spectacularly, but I knew she wouldn't stop there. She had already taken a step too far, and people like her don't retreat. They double down. At the station, the charade unraveled faster than I expected. The two so-called officers folded under pressure like cheap lawn chairs. It didn't take hours, not even minutes. Within 20 minutes of questioning, one of them was already blurting out names and details, desperate for a plea deal. "It wasn't our idea," the taller one stammered, sweating under the fluorescent lights. "We were told to do it. She said you'd cave if we put pressure on you. She said it was just a scare tactic." She didn't need a name. I already knew. Nancy Grant. The second man confirmed it, nodding frantically. "She promised us $5,000 each, said she'd cover us if anything went wrong, said nobody would call the cops because the whole neighborhood was scared of her." His eyes darted to me, realizing too late who exactly he was talking to. Nancy's fingerprints were all over this scheme. And now I had a signed confession, fake badges, body cam footage, and security cam video. It wasn't a matter of whether she was guilty, it was a matter of how long her sentence would be. We brought Nancy in that evening. She arrived in heels and pearls, still wearing her crown of smugness. She sat across the table and folded her arms like a queen before her subjects. "This is a misunderstanding," she said sweetly. "I was simply trying to protect the integrity of our community." I slid the file across the table, outspilled photos of the fake badges, transcripts of the confessions, stills from the body cam footage. Her smile faltered. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I told her coldly. "It's a criminal conspiracy. You orchestrated impersonation of peace officers, unlawful detention, and trespassing. That's felony territory." Her lawyer squirmed in his seat, whispering about negotiations, but I wasn't interested. The evidence was bulletproof, the charges stacked high, and the court would make the final decision. For once, Nancy wasn't in control. The next day, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting. For years, the NEI. Schichbors had lived under her iron grip, too afraid to challenge her fines and threats. But now, with the truth laid bare, the crowd erupted. One by one, they demanded her removal. The vote was unanimous. Nancy was stripped of her presidency, banned from ever holding office in the HOA again, and slapped with legal fees that would bleed her dry. The neighborhood was free, but not without scars. People realized how close they had come to letting fake authority consume their lives. As for me, I stood on my porch that evening with the weight of both roles on my shoulders, neighbor and chief of police. Justice had been served, but I knew deep down this wasn't just about Nancy. This was about the dangers of unchecked power, no matter how small or suburban it appears. Because when people pretend their rules are above the law, they don't just break trust, they break the very fabric of community. And sometimes it takes a badge to stitch it back together. Nancy's fall should have been the end of it, but criminals rarely accept endings on anyone else's terms. A week after her arrest, my officers processed her bail release under strict conditions. No contact with HOA members, no administrative duties, and certainly no further involvement with the men she'd hired. But I knew Nancy. She wasn't the type to slink quietly into the shadows. She was vindictive, desperate, and cornered, and that made her dangerous. Rumors spread through the neighborhood almost immediately. A neighbor down the block told me Nancy was seen late at night, slipping into driveways, whispering through cracked windows. Another swore they'd caught her taking photos of my house from her car. I doubled security around my property, not out of fear for myself, but to protect my family and the neighbors who might get caught in her spiral. Then came the letter. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper slid under my front door in the dead of night, scrawled in jagged handwriting, "You think you won, but this neighborhood is mine. You'll regret crossing me." It was the last straw. I launched a deeper investigation into Nancy's tenure as HOA president, combing through years of financial records and board decisions. What I found made her impersonation scheme look like child's play. Misappropriated funds, falsified maintenance invoices, kickbacks from contractors. The woman had been running a racket under the HOA's nose for nearly a decade. The clipboard and bogus letters were just her surface-level intimidation. Beneath it all, she was stealing thousands from the very people she pretended to protect. I compiled the evidence and handed it directly to the district attorney. The case ballooned overnight. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The charges piled up until the list read like a catalog of white-collar crime. When the warrant was issued, my officers didn't just arrest Nancy. They raided her home, uncovering boxes of falsified documents, a stash of cash, and even more counterfeit badges she had ordered online. She wasn't just playing president, she was trying to build her own fiefdom. This time there was no smug grin when we brought her in. No pearls, no heels, no clipboard. Just a hollow stare as she realized her empire had crumbled. She was booked without ceremony, held without bail, and eventually convicted. The sentence, 10 years in federal prison. The HOA, now free of her shadow, restructured completely. Neighbors who once whispered behind blinds came together, rebuilding trust and community. The board instituted transparency rules, open meetings, and safeguards against any future power grabs. For the first time in years, Elmwood Drive felt like a neighborhood instead of a dictatorship. One evening, as I stood on my porch again, the same porch where Nancy's imposters had once tried to arrest me, I felt the quiet weight of closure. My truck sat parked in the driveway, exactly where it belonged. Kids rode bikes up and down the street. Sprinklers clicked on in the summer dusk, and for once, there were no letters taped to doors, no threats slid under mats, no false authority hanging over us. The law had done its job. Justice had been served. But the lesson was clear. Power, no matter how small or suburban, corrupts when left unchecked. Nancy learned it the hard way. The neighborhood learned it through fear. And I, as both their chief of police and their neighbor, made sure none of us would forget. Because in the end, an HOA can pass rules, print letters, even hire imposters. But when they try to bend the law, they'll always find the law waiting. Sometimes on the very porch they tried to intimidate.